Hello, I'm Craig Constantine. Today I'm talking with David Wilk. Welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Craig. This is fun for me as a person who usually does the interviewing. It's nice to be the
Yes.
interviewee.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that you enjoy that because, yeah, I know what you mean. I don't mind. I love this side, the driving chair, but yeah, it's podcasting. And anybody listening a lot knows what I'm about to do. Podcasting is a lonely road, no matter how many guests you have. It's really just you. So tell me, what number are you on approximately, and when did you start?
I have no idea. I haven't lost count of how many episodes I've done. I started in 2008. I've had a mixed level of engagement. So over the course of 14 years, I think it's about 450, maybe 460. I do one
Outstanding.
every other week for the most part. So 25 a year, basically.
So that's a point. There are, people who like are happy to get to one or 10 or 100. And I wanted to just put that out for people listening so that you have a feel for where David is coming from when he says things that I know we're going to say. And you have extensive experience. And I mentioned before we started, I don't know much about books. I mean, I can read books, but other than that, but you have extensive experience in publishing. And I was looking at some of your current projects, and I think you and I are of a like mind about, so I'm going to say, the big kids of the world in podcasting, PRX, BBC, Spotify, they're really well equipped. They're like the giant book publishers, Simon and Schuster and all the other ones that I can't think of. And then you have the people who are the indie authors, the podcasters mostly. And yeah, sure, there's people who get paid to work for BBC, but most people are making podcasts out of their own pockets. And in the middle, there's nothing to help those people. And I feel, from what I understand of book publishing, that the imprints, the I don't know if small imprints or single imprint companies are the guys in the middle that help decide this book, this needs to see the light of day. Oh, here's what you need to do to make it a little bit better. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on in podcasting space when you look at podcasting, since you have the same amount of experience almost in that whole industry. What are your thoughts on what's missing, maybe between, Craig's got a microphone and some gear, and I'm publishing on Simplecast.
Well, I think there is a similarity between media forms where we have low barrier to entry. So therefore, you have tons of content. Like
Right.
I mean, there are tools you need to use in order to do a podcast, and there are lots of tool providers. So anyone can create a podcast. Anyone can create a YouTube channel. Anyone can create a TikTok. Um, and I mean, not anybody can create a book, but a lot of people can write books.
Yeah.
And the tools for publishing them, either self-publishing or working with structures that provide the access to publishing or podcast, making your podcast available. Very similar. The availability is no problem. The difficulty is because availability creates abundance of content that none of us has a substantial audience, and we're all dividing up the millions of people, but it's sort of aggregate. We see the same thing that um, the large audiences are for a limited number of
Yeah.
outlets,
Right. The
and it's going
tall
to be
head. Right.
yeah. And the commercial space is where though you're going to find that because that's what people find out about.
Mm.
There's validation for that. I mean, people being the consumer, and so um, you have small numbers of outputs that have large audiences, and then you have they used to talk about the long tail, but it's really the long body. We talk in the publishing business, we used to talk about long tail, kind of then the body and then the head. The head gets all the business, the body gets some, and then the tail divides up everything else. But it's really gotten even worse now, or over the last 20 years, so that what they used to call mid list. Mid list, you'd have front list, mid list, and back list. Mid list
Mhm.
is, just as the term kind of indicates, what would sell almost as well, but not as well as the big, but better than the tail. But really, it's now kind of gotten worse.
There's
So
no more mid list.
there's no more
And then
mid
in
list.
podcasting, they're really well, it's actually hard to tell, but there really wouldn't be a mid list per se in
Yeah,
podcasting, really.
no.
Um,
There's the
what do
top
you,
end and then everybody else,
right?
basically.
It's like a delta function. It's like two kids have all the toys. Hey, what, so that if that's, we've sort of like sketched a little picture of like a perspective we have on the podcasting industry. Was that what led you to work on your newer project, Live Writers? What, and like, or is it you saw an opportunity that was a little different, or like, what's the mission there?
No, that's a really good question. I think that my impulse was partly based on that idea that of curation, that if there is an abundance of content and I'm a listener or a reader, it's very helpful to have someone giving me ideas like
Right.
what should I listen to. And so one way of doing that is I saw that there was a theater, collection of theater podcasts, and I
Mm,
thought that was really smart. Like if you're interested in the theater, you can go to this one site, and
mm,
they have kind of curated what they think are podcasts that you'd be interested in if you want to know about the theater. And
right.
in publishing or in books, I thought, well, there really are three channels. There's what readers are interested in. There's what writers are interested in, and then there's what publishers are interested in. So you could divide up all the book related podcasts into those three categories, and that's what I did with Live Writers.
Ah,
So there's kind of like a channel for readers, a channel for publishers, and a channel for writers, because writers are really interested in podcasts about the writing experience, talking to writers about like how do you deal with character development? How do you write a story? Like the
mm.
mechanics of it.
Yeah,
How do
different
you
formats and tools and
yeah,
mediums and
yeah, and how do you make a living? Or how do you juggle writing books when you have children and all the things that writers have to deal with? That was something that I thought would be really interesting, is to create these three kind of lit channel unit
mm,
breakdowns, and that's what Live Writers is about. We aggregate as many of the book related podcasts as I could find. And there probably are more that I didn't find. And people could submit, you can send an email and say, add me to the podcast list.
mm.
Um, and then, of course, then the question is, does this do anybody any good? Which I don't
Right.
know.
So does it do any good? Like, or have you, or is it like a shell game where you're like, yeah, I've moved the problem, but I still have the same problem. How are people going to discover the project that's doing the curation and the
Well,
aggregation?
that's exactly right. The problem then goes to, okay, now you've created this curation, and you can't build it and they will come, because that never works.
I
Uh,
agree. That's like the biggest fake thing that was ever sold to anybody. Is just build it and they will like. I blame the
right.
movie. What was it? Field of Dreams.
Yeah,
It's like,
right.
no, you can't. It doesn't work. I mean, you can build it, but nobody's going to show up. It doesn't
Exactly.
work like that.
That happens a lot to us. And so I'm still struggling with that because it is very different. I find it actually, I've always thought that marketing books, which is what marketing is helping audiences find things that they're interested in, and podcast real pod, if I have a podcast, how do I let people know about it?
Right.
I think the tool set for podcasts, like marketing, is actually less well developed than it is for books.
Oh, I
So
would definitely agree. Yes.
and I think it's still hard to market books, but
Mm.
it's really hard to market podcasts.
I'm suddenly struck by, um, I was going to say, remember when, but I don't want to get on my soapbox. But remember when, um, so books are, unless you're like in a book club, like sitting around and talking about a book, books are a very solitary thing. Like even if you're all reading together, we're all doing it individually. I mean, aside from reading to your children, it's, you pick
Yep.
up the thing, you immerse yourself, you and the author are having this conversation. And that's exactly what podcasts are. I mean, yes, there's edge cases to everything, but generally it's the same thing. And yeah, some people hand me books like I'm, thinking about my entire life experience. People have handed me books that usually doesn't go as well as people would hope. I'm like, oh, I don't like that. But sometimes people handed books and sometimes people hand me podcasts. I get people say like, this episode, you should listen to this, or
Mm.
like, I find one of yours, like that kind of thing. So it kind of, they feel the same. Like they
Yeah.
feel like it's an individual experience, and they're a little bit complicated to pass to each other. Um, but like, what the heck? Podcasting just seems to be getting no traction at all in like a grassroots growing of an audience for a particular show. And I guess my question is, am I wrong that grassroots growing of authors actually used to work, or did it
It
not work in that industry
it
either?
no, it's always worked. It's just that it's never been easy to. Um, it's like you think that there's a lever to pull for building a grassroots uh,
Hmm.
interest in books. It doesn't really work that way. It's people find books, and there's a sort of mystery of how a word of mouth thing will happen in support of a book. And I think that's true for any of the media. If people really do find it compelling. You want to tell people. You want to tell your friends,
Mm.
and I think one of marketers are always trying to figure out how to make that happen. I say make as in quotation marks,
Right. Be the
or and
catalyst to set it off. And that's
yeah,
not a thing. That's
it
hard.
it is really hard because um, culture is really an organic um, thing. It's changing all the time, and no one can understand readers because readers are human beings and there are too many of us and it's too complicated. But
Right.
yes, I mean, there is still, marketers have figured out data tools for doing that. If you're on Facebook or Amazon, they have a lot of information and they actually can pull those levers. But for us as the creators, we don't have access to that data. We don't have
Mm.
access to those tools. And we can't afford them. It's like I always think about this with marketing a book. It's an individual thing. Well, 150,000 books published a year. There are, I don't know what, 12 million books in print. Um,
You.
if you think about um, how branding works, like if let's say you're a car manufacturer, every time you advertise, you mention your name. Well, you
Mm.
may have different models,
Badges. Yeah.
but
Right.
you're still Honda, Chevy, Ford, whatever. But a book, if a publisher publishes 1,000 books a year, or 200 books, or 10 books a year, each book is different. There is
Mm.
no brand continuity, so I have to market each book
Like
separately,
from
and it has
scratch.
yeah,
Right.
and it's so. I think of book marketing as sort of like a snowflake. It melts and it's gone. Whereas marketing is really about building a snowstorm and
Yeah.
building
Getting
up a
some
whole
accumulation. Right.
yeah, and we can't do that. And
I'm suddenly thinking about how many metaphors can we jam into one?
I know.
But I think I'm following. I was just thinking about, like, I'm in my head, I'm visualizing, somebody sharing a book, which is at the very least, they're sitting around going, "Oh my god!" And then this happened, and then they're telling the story of the book or the experience that they had with the book, or they physically hand the book, and that all works with podcasts too. But now I'm thinking, yeah, except the way you would share a podcast with me now is going to be virtually, because just,
Yeah.
I think Western society is, aside from the whole COVID pandemic, Western society tends to be more separate little islands. I love Aldous Huxley's island universes metaphor. But I'm also thinking, if let's say I'm on Facebook, I don't share podcasts. I mean, Craig does, but average people don't share podcasts, because
Yeah.
to share something with somebody else, we all know that I'm partly exposing myself to the data machinations of marketers, but I'm like expending some of my like online credibility by saying publicly, where it's immortalized forever, I like this episode. And I'm thinking like, oh, that's a whole nother level of friction. Like that cultural, the online culture has like this whole feeling of an
No,
additional
that's
layer of
true.
friction. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that until I
Yeah.
was just visualizing you're talking about like the life of a book and how it gets shared. And I'm like, here comes my cousin with a book versus here comes my cousin with a podcast. And it like works different. I don't
Well,
know if I have a question there.
no, but I think that's there's a point there, and that is virtual. products or virtual experiences are harder to share in some ways. Easier because I can just send you a link, but
Right.
that it still requires me to give you a whole wrapper about what I'm sending you. And if I sit, what you were talking about earlier is I've thought about this a lot, like comparing a book to music or a podcast to music. That's music is public. We listen to it. We can listen to it amongst ourselves, but we don't listen to a podcast on speaker for
Right.
it's
Yeah. It's not a
you listen
thing.
to it privately. It's your personal experience. So that kind of inherently makes it harder to share. And just as you said, the reading experience is also personal. And yes, the book is physical, so you can see the cover, and I can say, you would like this book if you would just try it. But you still have to sit down and try it. And the
Yeah.
same thing is true of the podcast. If I tell you about a good podcast, that requires you to sit down,
Mm.
focus your attention, go to a site, put on headphones or your earbuds and actually listen.
Yeah.
That's hard.
That's another point. And this I've noticed before, but I think it's worth putting in here too. Um, so I'm like, I'm like in my space here, and I do not like audio coming out of my computer. I dislike that. And I love like books, they stay exactly where I put them. They sometimes they close themselves, but like they're these beautiful, like, I'm a book lover, but I love that it never yells at me. And when I listen to even music or audio, there's like an activation energy in my head. Like, do I really want this music to be heard in the rest of my house, or should I put my headphones on? And for podcasts, with very few exceptions, I have to be really in a hurry. I always put headphones on to listen to podcasts. And that's like another barrier. It like drives me further into my segregated personal universe. And the opportunity, like if my wife walks in the room and I have my headphones on, she understands I'm working or something. But the opportunity for her to even see that that's a podcast, whereas with
Right.
book, it's like, yeah, you mentioned this
Right.
came to mind when you said people see the book. I'm like, yeah, you can't even see that this is a podcast. It's just headphones. It's like another friction.
Yeah. No, I think about it. People have talked about this in New York, where if you were riding the subway years ago, you would be
Mhm.
able to see what everyone was reading.
Right?
And they would either be reading the newspaper, a magazine, or a book, or nothing. And today, if most people have headphones or they have earbuds,
Earbuds
you
in.
have no idea what experience they're having. You can't even, and you can't share it in any way. There's no
Right.
vicarious, like I could lean over your shoulder and read your newspaper. I can't.
Or at least I can read the B side. I can read the back page while you're
Yeah,
reading the front page. Yeah.
exactly. So that there's this sort of antisocial element to these personal experiences that we're having because they are personal by definition, and I think that's also part of the impediment to a broadening of sharing of experiences because they are so personal and so in a way antisocial, even though what you're listening to might be you're engaging with all these people, but they're not
Yeah.
the people next to you. They're somewhere else.
Hmm. I'm watching our time tick away. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, like anything that you've seen that's I'm going to say maybe a glimmer of hope for podcasting or podcast curation or podcast sharing.
Well, just the pure fact that podcasting has become so popular to me is obviously a confirmation of something that I was interested in for a long time. I love audio as an experience
Mm.
and the talking, which talking in a non-commercial space where I'm in the room with you, we can have phenomenal conversations that are just incredibly interesting, and then they're gone. They're
Yeah,
back to
I
my
found that
snowflake
too.
metaphor. They just disappear. The beauty of podcasting is, although obviously lots of it will not be wonderful,
Double edged, right?
important, yeah, but it is saved for history if God help us, somebody out there in the future wants to listen to this stuff. But there is a lot of really cool stuff that happens. And I like the creativity that podcasting has uh, engendered, creativity and culture is really powerful. And we've created this new world, and I think it's fantastic.
I love that idea of creativity in culture. That's a great point. Um, David, as much as I like would want to keep talking forever, I want to be mindful of your time and my listeners' time. So I'll just say thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.